I want to bring in my panel for this afternoon, Liberal MP Tim Wilson and Labor MP Anne Ali. Hello to both of you. Tim Wilson, your home state of Victoria has stressed that schools will continue remote learning during term 2, yet the federal government, your government that you're a member of, is kind of trying to bring forward some payments for independent schools to incentivise them to open sooner. But the Prime Minister keeps telling us to listen to the state Premier. Isn't this muddying the waters and making it confusing?
No, the Commonwealth Government has a relationship with the Catholic education system and independent schools. The states run state schools. That's the way it is. That's the way it has been for a very long time. So it is up to state schools and up to the state Premier to decide when to reopen state schools. It's up to the Commonwealth to assist independent schools and Catholic schools. And what we know is they've got cash flow challenges associated with fees and people paying it. So we're providing a pathway for them to be able to get cash flow so they can support students and support staff, and of course also consistent with the medical advice, and that's the basis of the Commonwealth's decision around schools, allow them to open. Okay,
you think that the schools should open. You've been pretty outspoken about this, but isn't that largely up to the state premiers? Isn't it just their call to make that decision based on the medical advice they're getting from their own medical officials?
Well, as I said, we've had consistent medical advice from the federal bodies that it is safe to open schools, and independent Catholic schools made independent decisions to close or to have students operate remotely before the state system did. And all this is a continued respect for their independence and for their choice about how they wish to operate, which is not at the direction of the state Premier. And so it's consistent advice. The state government runs state schools, but where independent schools and Catholic schools have the freedom to choose, and if they have cash flow issues, the Commonwealth is saying we're here to support them, as is consistent with existing policy.
Anne Ali, you've heard the argument being framed there by Tim Wilson. Independent Catholic schools run, or at least funded by the federal government. State schools are different. Is that a sort of consistent message, or should there sort of be the same rules around all schools?
Clear as mud, Patricia, clear as mud. Look, I've got to admit, I'm really confused by the whole school situation. I'm confused by the argument that, you know, that the virus isn't spread by children, but then they can't go and visit their grandparents. I'm just as confused as all the parents who are contacting me and wanting answers. And I think, you know, that parents have a right to have answers about this, but I also think that we should be thinking first and foremost about the children and the working environments. Schools are not working environments, so we also need to be thinking about the teachers as well. Look, I don't know about this extra funding for the private schools that the government has just announced. We haven't seen the details. I'd like to know if that's going to go to some of the teachers, the casual teachers who have lost their jobs as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we will wait and see. But I stand by, I still think it's really, really confusing. If I find it confusing, I think that a lot of other people would find it confusing too.
I want to talk about relaxing restrictions, because the Prime Minister has given a really strong indication that we're back on the road, back rather, from the pandemic, and that some states are already, of course, rolling back restrictions. The Deputy Chief Medical Officer says a second wave of COVID-19 cases remains possible in Australia, and we will see these different rules in different states and territories. What's your view, Tim Wilson? Because we're seeing, for instance, even in New South Wales, that had the highest rates in the country and had the highest rates in the country, a slight relaxing of the rules, but more of a hard line in Victoria. We haven't heard about a relaxing there. Should there be consistency?
Oh, well, no, it's up to each state government who runs each state to design rules reflective of their circumstances. And of course, they're different. And it comes down to simple things like the weather in Victoria, apart from the fact that it's a terrible day outside and rainy and grey. The reality is we have different weather from different parts of the country, which means people do different things at different times and of the year. So it's important to have local laws that reflect local conditions. And so, and it's also, frankly, about how we test what works and doesn't work. We're all going through this journey together. but enabling states to be able to have their own laws and their own reflections that reflect their local circumstances based on where there are outbreaks and the cause of those outbreaks means that we can trial and learn and grow and hopefully get through this crisis and give people maximum freedom to be able to live their lives.
Are you keen to see Victoria adopt the New South Wales rule that 2 adults can visit another household?
Well, I think everybody's keen and enthusiastic for as many of these rules to be loosened as quickly as possible. I don't think I'm sure there are other people in other states who want other parts of rules active. I'm sure some Victorian teachers want the WA rules around public schools, where in WA, children are allowed to go back to public schools. So it's about what works, what's practical, and of course I'd love to see that opportunity, but ultimately the laws are designed by those in state parliament. If I wanted to implement those laws, I would have run for state parliament.
Ah, okay. Good point. You're not in the state parliament, you're in the federal one. That's why you're invited on today. Anna Lee, WA has taken a very different approach and, of course, a pretty hard approach on your own domestic border. Would you like to see that loosened?
Well, it's our hard approach on the domestic border that's kept us with numbers so low here in WA, Patricia, and that's enabled us now to go to 10 people being allowed to gather as long as they maintain social distancing. So, Tim, you can always bring your dog Louie and come over here if you really want to. Come and visit me and my dog Gucci in WA, but it's the reason. It's the reason I think in Western Australia as well, a lot of Western Australians are very much aware of the reasons why our borders were so strongly closed and our regional borders as well. And the Premier here, Martin McGowan, has done a wonderful job in taking the community with him on this journey and explaining to the community why that was necessary. So as long as there is a risk of a second wave, I think people here in WA are happy to follow the rules that our Premier is putting in place.
Just before we finish up, I just want to talk about this kind of ongoing argument with the Chinese embassy that we're seeing. Tim, if I can start with you, on this push for an independent inquiry, are you surprised by these escalating comments from the Chinese ambassador?
Well, I'd say I'm disappointed by them. I mean, the Australian government has simply stood up and said we should have an independent inquiry into the origins. Now, only a couple of weeks ago, you had Chinese officials trying to point the finger at the United States as the origin. So if that's genuinely their view, then they should have no issue with the independent inquiry. And I think the Prime Minister got the tone 100% right today, where he said that we're a sovereign nation, we have a right to exercise our sovereign voice, and we won't be intimidated by other countries who want to try and tell us what to do. And I can assure you that's absolutely my sentiment. We're a fiercely proud sovereign nation. We'll stand up for what we believe is right, not just for ourselves, but for the world, and we'll make those decisions based on what is appropriate and consistent and in our national interest.
And Ali, have you been shocked by these comments by the Chinese ambassador, and also a doubling down, essentially a leaking of a DFAT call?
I wouldn't say shocked, to be honest with you, Patricia. But look, I stand with Tim on this one. I think that that we should be backing an inquiry into this, along with the rest of the world. I mean, the entire world has been impacted by this in such a profound way. So I'm with Tim on this, that we should be. I've argued for a very long time that we need to revisit our relationship with China, and particularly our relationship with China in the region, with rising soft power being exercised by China over the last decade in particular or so. And I think this probably is an opportune time to really talk about this and get this out on the table and develop a roadmap for how we engage with China into the future.
And does it seem now that that relationship is a little off the rails, Tim Wilson? I mean, it's the only way to describe it, isn't it?
No, it's a relationship between two countries making a decision and voicing their opinions, and it's one where it should be built on a mutual understanding that we have a right as a sovereign nation to be able to make our decisions. They have a right as a sovereign nation to make their decisions. We won't always agree, but we would expect them to respect us as a country. We are not a client state of another country. We are an independent nation, and we are a sovereign nation. That's the basis of the relationship. And
Anna Lee, is it economic bullying what they're doing?
Oh, look, I think that's part of it. Yeah, I don't know that I'd use exactly those words, but they're certainly using all the levers that they can to try and get the best outcome that they see they want for themselves. And, if they're going to use economic levers, any kind of soft power or hard power levers, they'll use them, or soft power in hard ways, as we've seen as well. So, it is a little bit, but, as Tim says, we're a sovereign nation and we have a right to protect our national interests. And I know that China would argue the same for anything that they say as well, that they would argue that they're a sovereign nation that has a right to protect their sovereign interests. And the best thing that we can do is continue dialogue and work this out with China through dialogue and through mutual understanding.
Thanks to both of you for joining me on the panel this afternoon.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia.
Liberal MP Tim Wilson and Labor MP Anna